I'm digital artist Aaron Rutten, and this is a demonstration of some of the new brushes I created for Corel Painter in January of 2018. The first brush that we'll take a look at is called Oily Dab Knife. This brush is compatible with Corel Painter 2018 and later because it's using the enhanced liquid method. It's also compatible with the Wacom Art Pen, so you can rotate the angle of the brush. And as its name implies, it uses the dab stencil, which can be set to flow map, paper, or texture. So let's go ahead and do a test stroke with this. You can see that if I keep my brush rotated this way, I can get a nice flat stroke. But if I rotate it the opposite direction and I do that same stroke, it's thinner, and that's because I can rotate the angle of my brush. And so I can get kind of a mix between the two. That might work really well for doing something like a river that then turns into a waterfall that's spilling over the edge, like so. You might also want to use it for trees. You can build up little tree shapes like this if you want a more impressionist looking tree. The colors blend together nicely because of this nice oily effect. So I could put in some highlight colors here like so. Might also work really well for adding texture. You can of course change the flow map to a different flow map. If I wanted this hot lava, for example, it gives me a different effect or a different pattern. Let's try another one. Let's try fine dots, and I get a more sandy dotted pattern. You can of course change the scale and the contrast of the flow map as well to get different results. Now if you don't want to use the flow map as the source, you can also use paper, and then you can change the paper grain to something else. For example, I could change it to pebbleboard, then I get a pattern like that, whereas if I change it to small dots, then I get a pattern that's more like that. So these dab stencils are stenciling off your dab or preventing your brush from painting in that textured area. You can also set your dab stencil to texture. We could choose this desk paint texture. We'll want to show our texture to see where it's going to be active. So if we paint over here, then we can get a little bit of that desk texture. I can see that might also work well for doing old wood and things like that. If you press down very lightly with this brush, you get kind of a thin, almost dry brush effect. If you press down more firmly, then you get a wetter, more runny effect. If you want to reset this brush back to its default settings, you can just click on the reset button. And of course, we'll have to change the flow map back as well to what we had originally. And that's the Oily Dab Knife. The next brush that we'll look at is called Oily Dry Bristles. This gives you kind of a nice dry oil brush effect. So I'm going to select white. I can also rotate the angle of this brush with the Wacom Art Pen. So I can put in these fluffy clouds here like this, or I can rotate my brush, do a bigger, broader, more cumulus kind of cloud. And I could rotate my brush and get something that's kind of in between as well. If we use light pressure, we don't get very much paint. If we use heavy pressure, then we get a lot of paint. I can see this brush also being very useful for painting in things like trees. Now, if you don't have the Wacom Art Pen and you want to change the angle of your brush strokes, an easy way to do that is just to go ahead and rotate the angle of your canvas. Now, the pen I'm using here is the Pro pen, which does not have a rotation feature, but you can see that I'm able to rotate the angle of that paint that I'm putting out by rotating my canvas. I can just double click on the rotation icon to reset it. This brush can also take advantage of the dab stencil, so just like with the previous brush, we can change the dab stencil from flow map to paper or texture, and we can change the flow map or paper to get some different results. For example, I could choose fine dots, and now when we paint with this brush, we get a more dotted pattern. If we want to change the dab stencil to paper, we can do that, and then pick something like this pebble board here. And now we get a pattern that might look better for clumps of leaves. Moving on to the next brush, we have Oily Wet Bristle, and this is similar to Oily Dry Bristle, except the paint is a little more wet. You can also use this with the Wacom Art Pen, and so I can do these vertical strokes, or I can do these more horizontal, wider strokes. This works really well for distant trees and adding texture, and maybe even putting in things like water ripples. Because it's kind of a wet brush, the colors blend together nicely. Now again, if you use lighter pressure, you get kind of a thinner result, whereas if you press down harder, you get a more wet, smeary result. But it's a very nice oily brush. And in case you were wondering, it does work on a separate layer with transparency. So for example, I can paint with this brush here, and then I can take that mark and I can move it elsewhere, and you can see that it retains its transparent areas. That's because it's using the new enhanced liquid method in Corel Painter 2018 and later. This brush uses the dab stencil as well, and that can be changed just like I showed you earlier for the paper and the flow map. The next brush we'll look at is called Size Velocity Knife. That's in the Palette Knives palette. And what size velocity means is that the size of the brush is going to be controlled by velocity, and velocity is how quickly you move the brush. If I move the brush really slow to make my stroke, it doesn't really change in size at all. If I move it really fast, you can see that it starts out wide and then it sharply shoots to a fine tip. And if I do something kind of in between, give it a little more time and a little bit smoother of a transition, then I can get these nice spiked effects. So I can see this being useful for doing things like eyelashes, and if you wanted to do fur or hair on an animal, it might work really well for that. But you have to do that right kind of stroke where there's kind of firm pressure that tapers off really quickly. It might even work well for drawing flowers if you do it in the opposite direction, or maybe even feathers for an exotic bird. If you're using a mouse, this velocity setting might be useful to get some expressiveness out of your brush because you don't have pen pressure. So for example, I can draw these flowers using my mouse as well. This particular brush should be compatible with older versions of Painter, so give it a try. And the last brush that we'll look at is not technically a brush, it is an image hose nozzle, and it can be found in the Painterly category. It's called Fan Pines Down. If we look in the thumbnail for that image hose nozzle, it's suggesting that we use linear size P color. So I'm going to choose linear size P color. Now I need to select my additional color in order to add color to this particular nozzle. And I can select the color that I want. And if I paint, you can see that I get these nice pine trees. If I just click and do one at a time, then I could place single trees, or I can make a whole forest very quickly. I can also go to stroke attributes. I can turn on stroke attributes to enable it and set the merge mode to something like multiply. And then I can create layers and layers of trees that get darker and darker. If I want them to get lighter, I can set that composite method to screen, and then they can get lighter as they build up on themselves. You can also just select linear size P without adding color to it, and that'll paint them out in this kind of grayscale fashion, and you could build up a forest like this. You could right-click on that layer, choose Select Layer Content, hide the selection with Ctrl-Shift-H, create a new layer, set the composite method of that layer to multiply. We want to make sure that we switch back to our main color, because most brushes use your main color, not your additional color. And then we could go ahead and we could tint this. We wanted to add some glazing to it. Now that I'm done with my selection, I'll go ahead and deselect it. I'll create a new layer. I'm going to select a dark color for my additional color. I'm going to go back to linear size P color. And you can also use this brush just to build up individual trees like this. Now I still have stroke attributes on. I want to go ahead and turn that off and try that again. You can see that I can build up these nice tall trees like this. If you start out with your brush pretty big and then you use your pen pressure and lighten your pressure as you go near the tip, you'll get a more realistic effect. If you want the trees to kind of come out at an angle, then you can choose linear size P angle D color. And then you can do your trees at an angle if you want. This is a really fun brush that'll make short work out of pine trees. And best of all, since it's an image hose nozzle, you can use it with older versions of Painter as well. So there you go, those are my brushes that I created in January of 2018. You can download those on my website at aaronrutten.com. I'll put a link to that in the description of this video. If you enjoyed these brushes, take a quick second to click the like button. And if you're new to my channel, I'd love to have you subscribe. I have a lot more Corel Painter videos like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.